The airplane cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight energy. Passengers settling into their seats, overhead bins clicking shut, and the hum of conversation filling the air. Among the travelers was a little girl, no older than 7, her bright eyes filled with excitement as she clutched her stuffed bunny close to her chest. She had never flown alone before, but she wasn't worried. Her father had told her everything would be fine, that the flight attendants were there to help her. But as the plane prepared for takeoff, something unexpected happened. One particular flight attendant, a woman in a neatly pressed uniform, seemed to take an unusual interest in the little girl. At first, it was small things. A sharp glance when she fidgeted in her seat, an impatient sigh when she accidentally dropped her juice box. But soon, her attitude shifted into something much worse. With a cold, almost annoyed tone, she spoke down to the girl, acting as if she were a burden rather than a passenger. Other travelers noticed, exchanging uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke up. The girl, feeling the tension, tried her best to stay quiet, afraid of causing more trouble. She didn't understand why the flight attendant seemed upset with her. She had done nothing wrong. When she accidentally knocked her napkin onto the floor, the woman's response was sharp and condescending. "Can't you sit still for 5 minutes?" She muttered under her breath, shaking her head. What the flight attendant didn't know, however, was that this little girl wasn't just any passenger. She wasn't alone. And the man sitting a few rows ahead, dressed in an elegant suit and calmly watching the scene unfold, wasn't just another businessman. He was her father. More importantly, he was the owner of the entire airline. As the flight attendant continued to treat the girl unfairly, completely unaware of who was watching, a storm was quietly brewing. And when the truth finally came out, the entire plane would be left in stunned silence. The little girl shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her small hands gripping the armrests as she tried to make herself as invisible as possible. She didn't understand why the flight attendant was being so mean to her. She had always been taught to be polite and respectful, but no matter what she did, it seemed like it wasn't enough. She wanted to cry, but she held back, remembering her father's words, "Stay strong, be patient." A few rows ahead, her father watched everything unfold, his expression unreadable. He had learned long ago that true character is revealed when people believe no one important is watching. And right now, this flight attendant had no idea who she was mistreating. He resisted the urge to step in too soon. He wanted to see just how far this would go. The flight attendant, unaware of the growing tension, continued with her duties, occasionally throwing irritated glances toward the girl. When the child hesitated while asking for a blanket, her response was dismissive. "We don't have extras. You should have brought one," she said coldly before walking away. Passengers nearby exchanged uneasy looks, but no one spoke up. They could sense something was off, but they weren't sure what to do. The girl hugged her stuffed bunny tighter, looking down at her lap. She felt embarrassed, like she had done something wrong. But she hadn't. She was just a kid, traveling alone for the first time, hoping for kindness. Her father remained calm, but inside, his patience was wearing thin. He had built his airline on the values of respect and excellent service. Every employee was expected to treat passengers with care, no matter who they were. And yet, here was someone on his own staff doing the opposite. The plane continued cruising through the sky, but the atmosphere in that section of the cabin was thick with tension. No one knew it yet, but the flight attendant's actions were about to catch up with her in a way she never expected. And when they did, the entire plane would be watching. The little girl shifted in her seat, trying to focus on the tiny screen in front of her, but she couldn't shake the heavy feeling in her chest. The flight attendant's cold behavior made her feel like she didn't belong, like she was in the way. She had flown before with her father, and everyone had always been so kind. But this time was different. She was alone, or at least, that's what the flight attendant thought. A few rows ahead, her father continued to observe. He noticed everything: her slumped shoulders, the way she nervously fiddled with the hem of her dress, the way the other passengers glanced at the scene but stayed silent. He understood why they hesitated. Confronting a rude employee mid-flight wasn't easy. But what the flight attendant didn't realize was that she wasn't just mistreating a child. She was openly disrespecting the daughter of the man who controlled her entire career. The tension built when the flight attendant returned. This time, she was holding a tray of drinks, and as she passed by the girl, she barely slowed down. "Here," she said sharply, placing a cup of water on the tray table with such force that it nearly spilled. The little girl startled and instinctively reached for it, but her small hands weren't fast enough. The cup tipped, spilling water onto her lap. She gasped, eyes wide with shock. The flight attendant clicked her tongue in annoyance. "Oh, great," she muttered, rolling her eyes. Instead of helping, she snatched a napkin from her cart and tossed it onto the table. "Try to be more careful next time." That was it. The father's jaw tightened as he finally moved. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket, and began making his way toward his daughter. Every step was deliberate, controlled. Nearby passengers straightened in their seats, sensing that something big was about to happen. The flight attendant, still oblivious, turned her back to the girl, continuing her service as if nothing had happened. But when she finally noticed the well-dressed man approaching, her confident posture faltered just a little. Something told her this wasn't just another upset passenger. The little girl's eyes flickered with a mix of relief and fear as she saw her father approaching. She didn't know what he was going to do, but she knew he wouldn't let this continue. She had been trying to be strong, trying to ignore the harsh treatment, but now, with him standing close, the tears she had been holding back burned in her eyes. She blinked rapidly, not wanting to cry, not wanting to make things worse. The flight attendant turned just as the man reached his daughter's seat. At first, she seemed indifferent, prepared to brush him off like any other frustrated passenger. "Sir, if there's a problem, please take your seat." "We're in the middle of service," she said, her voice clipped and impatient. She barely looked at him, too busy adjusting the tray in front of her. But then she finally met his eyes. There was something about the way he stood, calm but firm, composed but radiating an undeniable presence, that made her pause. She noticed the way other passengers were watching him, the hushed whispers passing between them. And suddenly, she wasn't so sure of herself. The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "My daughter deserves to be treated with kindness," he said, his tone measured, controlled. "And from what I've seen, that's not happening here." The flight attendant stiffened. "Sir, I treat all passengers equally," she replied quickly, her voice carrying a defensive edge. "I can't give special treatment just because." "You think this is about special treatment?" He interrupted, his expression unreadable. "You think basic respect is something extra you get to decide on." His words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that made the flight attendant hesitate. Passengers sat up straighter, their curiosity turning into full attention. Some of them had noticed his tailored suit, the confident way he carried himself. A few had already begun whispering, realizing that this man wasn't just another traveler. The flight attendant, now visibly unsettled, swallowed hard. "Sir, if you have a complaint, I suggest you take it up with the airline directly," she said, trying to regain control of the situation. That's when the man's expression changed, just slightly, just enough to send a chill through her. "I plan to," he said. "In fact, I'll take it up with the owner personally." The flight attendant frowned, confused for a moment, until it hit her. Her face paled slightly as realization dawned. Her breath caught in her throat as the pieces fell into place. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. The weight of what was about to happen pressed down on the cabin. The flight attendant had spent the last hour belittling a little girl, and now she was face to face with the one person she never should have crossed. The flight attendant's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of her serving cart. The confidence she had moments ago was quickly slipping away, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, and the weight of their stares pressed against her. She swallowed hard, trying to regain control of the situation. I don't understand," she stammered, though deep down she did. She was starting to put the pieces together, but she didn't want to believe it. "What do you mean you'll take it up with the owner personally?" The man remained calm, his expression unreadable. He didn't rush to explain himself. Instead, he let the silence stretch, letting her own thoughts catch up to the reality of the situation. Then, after a long pause, he spoke again. "Because I am the owner," he said simply. A hush fell over the cabin. The flight attendant's face drained of color, and for the first time, her usual sharp tone disappeared completely. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. She blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. Passengers exchanged stunned glances. Some leaned forward in their seats, others covered their mouths in shock. The little girl, still sitting quietly in her seat, watched the entire exchange with wide eyes. She knew her father was important, but she had never seen him like this before. So in control, so commanding, without even raising his voice. The flight attendant opened her mouth again, desperate to salvage the situation. "Sir, She started, but before she could continue, another voice interrupted her. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" A second flight attendant had appeared at the front of the aisle, and right behind her was the captain himself. His presence alone sent another ripple of unease through the air. The flight crew never stepped in unless something serious was happening. The passengers knew it, and so did the now visibly nervous flight attendant. The captain's sharp gaze landed on the man first, then shifted to the little girl, her soaked dress still clinging to her small frame. His jaw tightened slightly, and in that moment, he understood everything. Without hesitation, he turned his attention to the flight attendant in question. "I think we need to have a conversation," the captain said, his voice calm but authoritative. The flight attendant's breathing quickened. She could already tell this wasn't going to end well for her. The tension inside the plane had reached its peak, but just when it seemed like the situation couldn't escalate any further, the man, still composed, still in full control, tilted his head slightly and gave the flight attendant one last look. "You really should treat every passenger with kindness," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "because you never know who's watching." And with those final words, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The flight attendant stood frozen, her breath shallow as the weight of the moment crushed down on her. The captain's stern gaze didn't waver, and the murmurs from the passengers only grew louder. Every pair of eyes in the cabin was fixed on her, waiting to see what would happen next. The realization of her mistake hit her like a tidal wave. She had targeted the wrong passenger, and now there was no way out of the mess she had created. The little girl, still seated, clutched the damp fabric of her dress. Her father hadn't raised his voice once, yet his mere presence had changed everything. The power he held wasn't in loud threats or anger. It was in the quiet authority that made people listen. And right now, everyone was listening. "I sincerely apologize, sir," the flight attendant finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know." The man exhaled slowly, watching her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "You didn't bother to know," he corrected. His voice wasn't cruel, but the truth behind his words cut deeper than any reprimand. "You judged my daughter before even asking a question. You made assumptions. And now you're only apologizing because of who I am, not because you regret how you treated her." The flight attendant's lips parted, but no words came out. She knew he was right. She had never felt more exposed, more ashamed. The captain cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I'll be reporting this to the airline's management," he said firmly. His gaze flickered toward the father, silently acknowledging his authority. "I can assure you, sir, this behavior is not tolerated on our flights." A flight supervisor approached, gently placing a hand on the attendant's arm. "We need to speak privately," she said, her tone firm but professional. The flight attendant swallowed hard, nodding as she followed her down the aisle. As she disappeared from sight, the tension in the cabin finally began to ease. The father turned to his daughter, kneeling down to her level. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" he asked softly. The little girl nodded, though her eyes were still filled with uncertainty. "I didn't do anything wrong, did I?" Her father's expression softened as he brushed a curl from her forehead. "Not at all," he reassured her. "You were just being yourself. And that's more than enough." Passengers who had been watching the scene unfold began murmuring among themselves, some even offering sympathetic smiles to the little girl. The once tense atmosphere was now shifting into something else, something warmer, more understanding. Then, just as the father was about to return to his seat, a passenger a few rows away suddenly stood up. A woman in her 50s, dressed in a sharp business suit, stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and composed. The father turned to her, expecting another comment from an onlooker. But what she said next caught everyone by surprise. "I'm the regional director of this airline," she announced, her eyes locking onto him with recognition. "And I believe we have a lot to discuss." A ripple of shock ran through the passengers once again. The flight crew stiffened. Even the captain looked slightly taken aback. The father raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but not rattled. "I suppose we do," he said calmly. The woman nodded, then turned to the captain. "For now, please ensure that this flight continues without any further incidents." She then glanced at the little girl and smiled. "And see to it that this young lady gets a fresh, dry outfit from our first-class accommodations." The captain gave a respectful nod and immediately signaled another attendant to handle the request. The little girl beamed, her nervousness finally fading. As her father took his seat beside her once more, he cast one last glance toward the front of the plane, where the flight attendant had been escorted away. He hadn't come onto this flight expecting to teach a lesson, but sometimes life had a way of unfolding in unexpected ways. He leaned back in his seat, gently placing an arm around his daughter. "Looks like things are going to change around here," he murmured. And as the plane soared through the sky, the feeling in the cabin had shifted. The lesson had been learned, but more importantly, respect had been restored. As the flight continued smoothly, the little girl nestled into her seat, now wearing a fresh, warm sweater that one of the attendants had brought from first class. She sipped on a cup of hot chocolate, her earlier distress fading away with each passing moment. Her father watched her with a quiet smile, relieved that she was feeling better. The regional director, now seated a few rows ahead, occasionally glanced back at them, her expression thoughtful. She had already sent a message to the corporate office, ensuring that the incident would be reviewed thoroughly. While no one enjoyed seeing an employee face consequences, there were standards that had to be upheld, especially when it came to treating passengers with kindness and respect. A few passengers who had witnessed the scene earlier took a moment to offer the little girl encouraging smiles as they passed by. One woman, a mother traveling with her own child, leaned down and whispered, "You're very brave." The girl's eyes lit up at the unexpected kindness, and she gave a small, shy smile in return. The father, now more relaxed, glanced out the window as the sky stretched endlessly beyond the horizon. He had spent years building his airline with the belief that travel should be a welcoming experience for everyone, regardless of age, status, or background. Today had been a reminder that sometimes, even within his own company, there were lessons to be learned. As the plane finally began its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom, thanking everyone for their patience and wishing them a pleasant journey ahead. The little girl squeezed her father's hand, her earlier worries now just a memory. When they landed, the regional director approached once more. "I'll be in touch," she told the father with a respectful nod. "Things will change." He simply nodded, knowing that real change wasn't just about policies. It was about people learning to do better. As they stepped off the plane, the little girl looked up at him and smiled. "Can we fly again soon?" Her father chuckled, squeezing her hand. "Of course," he said. "And next time, it'll be even better."